If you want to know what it really takes to be a writer, you have to completely ignore the bestseller lists. Like, ignore the glitzy launch parties, the big six-figure advances, and, those breathless social media announcements.
Oh, yeah, totally. That's just the PR machine.
Right. If you want to see the actual psychological engine of a writer, you need to look at the people who have been publishing to just absolute deafening silence for 10 years. And they're still sitting down to type today.
That's the real test, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do they not go entirely insane?
Exactly. It is the defining question of the craft.
Yeah.
And I think it completely shatters the mythology we usually build around writing.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because when you start, the narrative you're sold is, well, it's incredibly romantic.
Oh, absolutely. You're told that writing a book is like putting a message in a bottle. You pour your deepest truths onto the page, cork it tight, and toss it into the vast ocean.
And you stand on the shore, right, just imagining someone finding it, unrolling the paper, and having their life forever altered by your words.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thought, but the reality is it's far more brutal. Writing a first draft is less like sending a romantic message in a bottle and a lot more like building a suspension bridge in the dark.
Wow.
In the dark. Yeah. You are hurling this heavy steel cable across a massive, terrifying chasm, desperately hoping it connects to the other side. And most of the time, you hear absolutely nothing hit the ground.
You just get the sound of the wind. Just, silence. And that silence is honestly what breaks most aspiring authors.
It's not bad reviews, right?
No, not harsh criticism. Just the profound, agonizing absence of a reaction.
Which is why today's deep dive is fundamentally different from, say, a standard writing workshop. We aren't just going to talk about grammar or plot structures today.
Right. We are building a masterclass designed specifically for you, the listener, to forge the psychological armor required to survive that chasm.
Exactly. Whether you are a seasoned author trying to break through a plateau, a weekend blogger, or, someone just terrified to open a blank Word document, this is your shortcut to resilience.
And our architectural guide for this entire deep dive is phenomenal. We are drawing heavily from the Write Well newsletter by Angela Hunt.
And we really need to pause and look at her pedigree for a second because it entirely changes the weight of this advice. We are not talking about a theorist here.
No, we aren't looking at someone who read a few books on story structure and, decided to monetize a blog. Angela Hunt is a veteran author with over 170 published books.
170. Just let that number sink in for you.
It's staggering. I mean, she spans multiple genres, writing for both children and adults.
Right, and to maintain that level of prolific output over decades, it requires a psychological framework made of absolute titanium. You don't produce that volume of work by relying on fleeting inspiration.
Or external applause, yeah.
Yeah.
You do it by mastering the internal game.
And I want to explicitly mention right here at the top, because we are going to be referencing it constantly, you can find this resource at angelahunt.substack.com. There's a free monthly edition and a paid weekly edition that is just a dense, concentrated shot of high-level writing mechanics.
It really is a masterclass delivered to your inbox.
So let's jump into the deep end. How do we actually deal with that maddening silence? Because Hunt offers this visual metaphor for the writing life that I cannot get out of my head.
Oh, the mountain climber. Yeah. Picture this. A man is wearing a thick red sub-zero snowsuit.
Okay.
He is trekking up a treacherous, blindingly white, heavily crevassed mountain that looks exactly like Everest. He's gripping an ice axe. The wind is howling. His breath is pluming in the freezing air.
Right. But strapped to his back, entirely inexplicably, is a massive, heavy, vintage cast-iron typewriter.
It is such an absurd, almost comical image.
It really is. But it captures the sheer, isolating lunacy of the endeavor perfectly. I mean, why are you dragging this heavy piece of machinery up a lethal ice wall?
Well, Hunt breaks this climb down into a series of, psychological rules for maintaining your sanity when no one is cheering you on. And I want to group these organically because the first cluster of her advice is all about severing the link between your self-worth and the audience's reaction.
Which is probably the hardest thing for a modern creative to do.
Oh, without a doubt. We are conditioned by social media algorithms to believe that a piece of content is only valuable if it generates an immediate dopamine loop of likes and comments.
Yeah.
Hunt's foundational argument is that you must absolutely separate your output from the response. Your job is to produce skilled work. The audience's job is to respond.
But wait, let me stop you there. Because the immediate pushback from anyone listening is going to be, Aren't we writing for an audience?
Right, the whole tree falling in the woods thing?
Exactly. If a tree falls in the woods and no one reads it, is it still a story? Doesn't severing that link just turn you into an arrogant artist who refuses to care if their work is actually engaging?
That's a highly common fear, but it really misunderstands the mechanics of the work. Hunt is not saying you ignore the reader's experience. She is saying your primary jurisdiction ends at the edge of the page.
Ah,
Your job, your only controllable job, is to produce honest, skilled, rigorous work. You engineer the bridge as best as you can.
Right, and the audience's job is to decide if they want to walk across it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you conflate those two jobs, you start contorting the architecture of your story purely to chase a reaction. You stop serving the narrative truth and start pandering.
And pandering inevitably creates hollow writing. Okay, I see the distinction. You are protecting the integrity of the work from the unpredictability of the crowd.
Yes, which leads directly into her point about how we interpret silence. Because the human brain abhors a vacuum.
Oh, big time. If we send a chapter to a writing group or publish a piece on a blog and we get crickets, our brain instantly fills that vacuum with the worst possible narrative.
They hated it. I'm a hack. I should burn my keyboard.
I'm never writing again? Yeah. It's a survival mechanism. We assume silence is a predator.
But Hunt points out that in the context of writing, silence rarely means active rejection. Often people hesitate to critique because they genuinely feel unqualified.
Right. They know a paragraph feels clunky to them, but they don't have the vocabulary of a literary editor to explain why it's clunky. So they say nothing rather than sound foolish.
And she also touches on something fascinating here regarding group dynamics. Like, if you post your work to a forum of 50 writers, you are highly likely to experience that psychological phenomenon called the diffusion of responsibility.
Oh, the bystander effect applied to creative feedback.
Exactly. Everyone looks at your chapter and assumes, oh, Sarah's usually great at pointing out plot holes, I'll let her do it.
And Sarah assumes Dave is going to do it, so nobody does it. The silence isn't a coordinated judgment on your talent. It's a glitch in human social behavior. It's not personal.
But acknowledging that doesn't solve the practical problem. You still need to know if the draft is working. Which is tip 3, building an internal feedback loop.
If the external voices are quiet or unreliable, you have to dramatically sharpen your own editorial eye. You have to learn to diagnose your own flat scenes.
Which also means moving to tip 4, creating a controlled feedback system. Stop asking people, what do you think?
Yes, because what do you think is such a useless question.
It really is. Instead, you need to ask targeted questions like, where did you lose interest? Or did you understand why the character lied in chapter 2?
You're directing their focus. But wait, this brings up my alarm bells a bit, because isn't relying almost entirely on an internal feedback loop a recipe for complete, unmitigated delusion?
How do you mean?
Well, we have all encountered self-published books or heard someone read at an open mic where the author clearly thought they had penned the next great American novel, and it was objectively, structurally disastrous.
Oh, sure.
So if I am the only judge of my work, how do you know your internal compass is actually pointing north and not just spinning wildly in a magnetic storm of my own ego?
It's a perfect challenge.
Yeah.
And it is the trap that catches thousands of amateur writers. But Hunt does not advocate for blind self-belief. She advocates for an internal compass that has been ruthlessly calibrated by reality.
Okay, but how do you get that friction if you are just starting out?
By starting small.
Yeah.
This is where the Everest metaphor comes back. You do not try to scale Everest on your first climb.
Right.
Before you attempt the 100,000-word sprawling epic fantasy novel, you write short stories. You write articles. Hunt suggests looking at resources like Writer's Market.
That's the directory of magazines and journals actively looking to buy pieces, right?
Exactly. So you pitch a small piece, a 1,500-word article or short story. You craft a professional query. You submit it, and you get rejected a lot.
Because that's just the business.
But eventually, you get accepted by a professional editor, not your mom, not your supportive spouse, but a stranger who is paying you out of a budget.
And when you sell that piece, you earn a small paycheck. Maybe it's just $50, but more importantly, you prove to your brain that you are a professional.
Yes. You endure the process of an editor taking a red pen to your darling sentences and telling you to cut the fluff. That process is what calibrates your internal compass.
So once you understand what a professional standard feels like on a small scale, you can apply that same ruthless diagnostic eye to your larger silent projects. You aren't living in delusion anymore. You have empirical data.
I love that phrase, empirical data. It ties perfectly into Hunt's next practical rule, number 5, tracking your growth in concrete terms.
Because when you are sitting in the silence, feelings are incredibly unreliable narrators. You might wake up on a Tuesday feeling like a fraud whose vocabulary is limited to fifth-grade sight words.
But that's just a mood. Moods are weather. The work is the landscape.
Oh, that's good. Moods are weather, the work is the landscape. Hunt says you have to look for evidence to combat the mood. Don't trust how you feel. Look at the paper.
Right. Set a draft you wrote this morning next to a draft you wrote 6 months ago. Highlight the differences.
Are the verbs stronger? Are the characters acting with clearer, more distinct intent? Has your dialogue stopped sounding like two robots exchanging exposition?
Building confidence, grounded in hard, visible evidence, holds up infinitely better than confidence built on fragile external praise.
Which is deeply related to her sixth rule: limit exposure to comparison.
Yes. The modern writer is constantly bombarded by other people's highlight reels. You open an app and see a peer announcing a massive book deal.
Or sharing a screenshot of a glowing 5-star review. It is psychologically draining if you are currently staring at a blinking cursor.
Because you are comparing your messy, behind-the-scenes reality to their carefully curated public relations moment. You are not seeing the 3 abandoned novels sitting on their hard drive.
You are not seeing the stinky, terrible rough drafts they cried over for 6 months. You are comparing your day 1 to their day 1,000.
So how do you insulate yourself from that? Hunt's mechanism is tip 7. Keep producing on a schedule.
She literally recommends typing the words, write, revise, polish, repeat, and physically taking them to your monitor. It becomes an industrial process.
Because if you have a steady output, the emotional weight of any single piece dramatically decreases. If you spend 3 years writing one short story and it gets rejected by a magazine, your entire identity shatters.
Right, but if you are churning out a new story every month, a rejection on story number 1 just means it's time to focus on story number 4.
The momentum itself is the cure for the silence.
It's the engine of production. She also mentions revisiting your original reason for writing, tip 8, just to keep that spark alive.
Yeah, reconnecting with why you even started. But even with a calibrated compass and a relentless schedule, your confidence will naturally fluctuate. You are not aiming for a state of robotic, unwavering certainty.
That doesn't exist in creative work.
Exactly. So tip 9 is accepting that fluctuation. And Hunt shares a phenomenal personal trick for when the self-doubt hits hard mid-draft.
The bracket trick. I love this. She will literally type brackets into her manuscript and write something like, this is terrible, but you can always fix it later, just keep moving, and she forces herself to continue to the next scene.
That bracket trick is an incredible psychological hack. It essentially functions as a pressure release valve for the inner critic.
By formally acknowledging on the page that the writing is currently bad, you give your perfectionist brain permission to temporarily shut down. You are saying, yes, I see the flaw, we have logged the flaw, now let's keep laying the track.
And usually, as Hunt notes, when she reviews it a week later, it wasn't the words that were terrible, it was just her blood sugar or her mood. It allows you to separate the drafting brain from the editing brain.
They cannot operate simultaneously.
They really can't. And that leads to her final tip for silence, number 10. Decide your standard. Let the work itself, the clarity, the depth, be the unmoving target, not the crowd's shifting tastes.
Okay, so we have this powerful framework. We are calibrating our compass, focusing on production, giving ourselves permission to write terrible, rough drafts to maintain momentum.
Right.
But let's say you're looking at that massive mountain, that Everest of a novel, and someone taps you on the shoulder, they point to your heavy vintage typewriter, and they say, why are you suffering? I have a helicopter right here. It's an AI model. It can generate your plot, flesh out your characters, and drop you at the summit of this mountain in 45 seconds.
The ultimate modern temptation.
Yeah.
And a profoundly dangerous one.
Yeah.
Because taking the helicopter completely, fundamentally defeats the purpose of the mountain.
This brings us to a visual metaphor that is the exact opposite of the freezing mountain climber.
Imagine an older, distinguished writer. He's sitting at a massive, heavy wooden desk. The room is quiet, lined with towering bookshelves.
He is meticulously editing a physical manuscript by the warm golden light of a desk lamp, peering closely at the ink through a magnifying glass.
It's a very quiet, almost holy image of total unbroken focus. And it visualizes a concept that Angela Hunt's husband used to talk about.
He was a youth pastor, right?
Yes, a middle school youth pastor for over 50 years. If you know anything about working with 13-year-olds, you know that you rarely see immediate, profound maturity.
Yeah, you're not getting deep philosophical breakthroughs from a middle schooler.
Exactly. You are planting seeds of character, empathy, and discipline that you might not see sprout until those kids are in their late 20s or 30s. He called this the invisible investment.
And writing is exactly the same mechanism. A debut novelist who suddenly hits the New York Times bestseller list didn't just get lucky on a Tuesday.
No, they have been writing, failing, studying, and agonizing in the shadows for a decade.
It's like a stand-up comic who bombs in empty, depressing clubs for 7 years before they suddenly look like an overnight success on a Netflix special.
Hunt quotes the author Robert Greene here, and it is a brilliant distillation of the problem. Greene points out that when we look at someone's massive success, we are grasping at an illusion.
We only see the visible opportunity, the final, polished product.
Exactly. What we completely miss is the slow, invisible accumulation of skills, the incremental, painful improvements, and the sheer calloused ability to withstand criticism. The invisible investment is what actually makes the artist.
The friction of the struggle is what creates the spark. And this is precisely why outsourcing that struggle to an artificial intelligence is a cognitive tragedy.
Hunt references the journalist Ezra Klein, who has spoken extensively on the hidden, terrifying costs of using tools like ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini to do your heavy cognitive lifting.
But let me play devil's advocate here for you, because people will argue it's just a tool, like a spell checker or a calculator.
Sure, you hear that a lot.
If I am building that suspension bridge in the dark and AI offers me a floodlight to outline my plot faster, why wouldn't I take it? It saves me hours of staring at a blank wall.
Because there is a massive categorical difference between a tool that assists execution and a tool that outsources cognition.
Ooh, that's a great distinction.
A spell checker points out a typo. It doesn't decide what you are trying to say. When you ask an AI to outline your plot or solve a narrative corner you've painted yourself into, you are outsourcing the exact cognitive friction that causes you to grow.
Ezra Klein points out that when you spend 7 hours grappling with a difficult book, reading it, taking notes, wrestling with the contradictions, having thoughts you absolutely would not have otherwise had, that topic physically gets inside you.
It alters your neural pathways. It impresses itself upon your mind. The time is the point. The struggle is the point.
Klein's argument is that reading and writing are not just about transferring data from a book to a screen. What reading and writing and processing information is supposed to do is change you.
Precisely. If society becomes entirely obsessed with the endpoint, if all we want is the finished 80,000-word product so we can hit publish on Amazon, we have entirely missed the richness of the human experience.
The richness lies in the expenditure of energy. It lies in the stumbling and the frantic pacing around the kitchen, trying to figure out why your protagonist's motivation feels flat.
It reminds me of the commencement speech Jerry Seinfeld gave at Duke University in 2024. He just eviscerated the concept of AI in the creative process.
Oh, I remember that. He called it the most embarrassing thing we've ever invented.
He joked that the advertising slogan for ChatGPT should be the exact anti-Nike. Instead of just do it, the slogan should be, you just can't do it.
It was a brutal, perfect critique of modern laziness. He was essentially asking, what? You can't do the work. You can't sit in the uncomfortable silence and figure it out yourself.
Right.
Using an AI algorithm to generate your plot twists or write your dialogue is exactly like paying a fitness model to go to the gym and lift weights for you, and then standing in front of your own mirror, genuinely confused and angry as to why you don't have any muscles.
You cannot outsource the resistance.
If you let an algorithm do the heavy lifting of asking, what if, and why would my character lie about this, you might end up with a structurally competent story, but it will be devoid of a human soul.
You shortchange the reader, but mostly you shortchange yourself. You prevent yourself from becoming the person who is capable of solving that narrative puzzle. You remain intellectually stunted.
So if we agree that the human writer must do the heavy lifting, we have to look at the actual weights we are lifting every single day, the raw material of the craft.
The words themselves.
Yes. I wanted to transition into a fantastic recurring feature in Angela Hunt's Write Well Substack, her Word of the Week. She doesn't just hand you a dictionary definition. She deconstructs the mechanics of how to wield these words like surgical instruments.
Let's look at a few of these, starting with a concept that dominates modern discourse.
Yeah.
Ad hominem.
From the Latin, literally translating to the person.
Right. It is a rhetorical fallacy where an attack is directed against the individual making an argument rather than engaging with the position or viewpoint they actually hold.
Hunt shares a deeply illuminating personal anecdote to demonstrate how this functions. She posted on her personal Facebook page around Good Friday. She made a mathematical historical observation.
Okay.
She noted that Jesus mathematically couldn't have died on a Friday if he was in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, as stated in the biblical text. The math of Friday to Sunday morning simply does not equal 3 nights.
A very standard academic and historical puzzle that scholars have debated for centuries.
Exactly. She made it clear her theological focus was on the resurrection itself, but the timeline math was just a point of historical curiosity. But a commenter replied to her, and this is a direct quote, saying, "This is why Paul told ignorant, uneducated women to keep silent in the churches, so delete this post and be quiet."
Wow. It is a breathtaking example of an ad hominem. Let's look at the mechanics of what the commenter did there.
They completely bypassed her mathematical premise.
Entirely. Instead of offering a counter-argument regarding ancient Jewish timekeeping or the translation of idiomatic phrases in Greek, the commenter simply attacked her identity as a woman, labeling her ignorant, solely to shut down the conversation.
And as a quick aside to you, our listener, we are looking at this purely through the lens of rhetoric, debate structure, and character dialogue. We aren't here to endorse any specific religious viewpoint or debate the theological timeline of Good Friday.
Right. The brilliance of Hunt sharing this is how perfectly it illustrates the defense mechanism of a weak arguer. When someone cannot attack the data, they attack the messenger. You see this everywhere.
You see it constantly in corporate environments. Someone proposes a new, highly efficient workflow in a meeting.
And a colleague who feels threatened doesn't critique the logistics of the workflow. Instead, they dismiss the proposal by calling the person overly ambitious or inexperienced.
You see it in consumer reviews, where a brand attacks the CEO of a rival company rather than comparing the actual battery life of their products. The structural formula is always ignore the claim because of the perceived flaw of the person making it.
But Hunt is careful to point out a massive nuance here that writers must understand. Not every mention of a person's character is an ad hominem fallacy.
Right.
Like if a financial expert goes on television and tells you to buy a specific pharmaceutical stock, and you point out that they currently sit on the board of that pharmaceutical company, that is a conflict of interest.
Questioning their credibility in that specific context is totally valid evidence. It is highly relevant to the argument. It's all about whether the criticism addresses relevant facts to the claim or if it just throws mud to distract the audience.
It's a vital distinction, especially if you are writing a courtroom drama or political fiction. Your characters need to know how to deploy and deflect these fallacies.
Moving to a much more poetic tool in Hunt's toolkit, let's examine the sensory mechanics of the word susurrus, or the noun susurration.
Oh, I absolutely love the mouthfeel of this word. Susurrus. You almost have to whisper to say it correctly.
That is intentional. It's an onomatopoeic word. It refers to a soothing, whispering, murmuring, or rustling sound.
Picture the specific dry sound of the autumn wind moving through dead oak leaves, or the gentle, continuous gurgling of a rippling brook over smooth stones.
Hunt notes she first fell in love with it reading a Dean Koontz novel. It is an incredibly evocative tool.
If you are trying to set a highly specific, atmospheric, perhaps slightly eerie or deeply calming mood in a scene, using the generic word whisper or rustle just doesn't carry the same acoustic weight.
The word susurrus physically slows the reader's internal monologue down. It forces them to hear the environment. Words really do have acoustic weight.
Now let's look at a tricky pair of words that Hunt brilliantly untangles. Hegemony versus homogenize.
They sound somewhat similar to the untrained ear, but they represent wildly different mechanisms of control. Let's break them down.
Hegemony refers to leadership, dominance, or sheer overarching influence, usually of one nation, social group, or economic system over another.
If a superpower government subjects a smaller nation's trade routes to its own will, it is exerting hegemony.
Merriam-Webster highlights this is often used for cultural influence, like the hegemonic dominance of Western pop culture in the 90s, or the dominance of the U.S. dollar in global financial markets. It is about an imbalance of power.
Right. It's about one entity standing aggressively above the rest. But to homogenize does something entirely different. It comes from the Greek root homos, meaning same.
To homogenize means to make a group of disparate things uniform, similar, or completely blended.
The stripping away of unique edges. Think of homogenized milk. The fat particles are forcibly broken down and blended uniformly through the liquid so the cream doesn't separate and rise to the top. It becomes exactly the same throughout.
So a corporate empire might exert hegemony over an industry, but a terrible corporate training manual attempts to homogenize the employees, ensuring none of them have any unique creative thoughts that deviate from the standard operating procedure.
One is about ruling from the top. The other is about aggressively blending the middle. And that idea of homogenization, stripping away unique edges to make everything blandly the same, is the exact opposite of our final word.
Which is all about weaponizing brevity and sharpness. Laconic.
Laconic, meaning brief to the point of absolute curtness.
And we must distinguish this mechanically from a character simply being taciturn. A taciturn person is habitually silent, withdrawn, or antisocial. They don't talk because they don't want to engage.
Right.
A laconic person, however, might speak rarely, but when they do, the brevity is pointed, deeply deliberate, and often dripping with subtext.
And the origin of this word is arguably the greatest historical mic drop in human history.
Oh, this story is amazing.
It literally comes from Laconia, the region in ancient Greece that contained the city-state of Sparta. The Spartans were legendary not just for their military brutality, but for their spare, muscular way of speaking. They despised bloated rhetoric.
They believed that if you needed 100 words to make a threat, you were weak.
Yes. So in 346 BC, Philip of Macedon, who was Alexander the Great's father, was marching his massive army across Greece, conquering absolutely everything in his path.
He was unstoppable.
He looks toward Sparta and he sends this terrifying, arrogant, highly wordy threat to the Spartan leadership. He essentially says, "You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze Sparta to the ground."
A completely bloated hegemonic threat.
And the Spartan magistrates read this long, terrifying scroll, and they sent back a reply consisting of a single solitary word, "if."
It's just magnificent. If.
One word. And it completely, utterly deflates the bluster of the most powerful king in the world. It's the ultimate display of confidence.
And as a writer, if you understand the mechanics of a laconic character, you can generate immense gravity in a scene.
How so?
Well, imagine you are writing a thriller. You have a scene with 3 highly anxious characters pacing around a safe house, talking rapidly, throwing out panicked plans, their dialogue taking up pages and pages of text.
Right, picture it.
And sitting in the corner is one laconic character, perfectly still, slowly cleaning a rifle. That silence acts like a vacuum. It draws the reader's eye.
Oh, wow.
When that laconic character finally stops cleaning the rifle, looks up, and speaks a single four-word sentence, it lands with the weight of an anvil. The tension is created purely by the contrast between the bloated dialogue of the panicked characters and the surgical strike of the laconic one.
So we have these heavy, precision-engineered words, the bricks of our story. But a pile of beautiful bricks is not a house. How do we organize them?
We need to zoom out from the micro level of vocabulary and look at the macro level of structural architecture. How do we build chapters, and how do we navigate the different lengths of fiction?
When it comes to chapter architecture, the most frequent, almost panicked question beginner writers ask is about metrics. They will ask, is 2,000 words exactly the right length for a chapter?
Or, am I allowed to have a 900-word chapter?
Why are we so obsessed with that specific number? Why the fixation on the math of the word count?
Because of the psychological safety blanket we discussed earlier, the creative process is terrifyingly nebulous. You cannot put a narrative arc under a microscope and definitively prove it works.
So writers seek control where they can find it.
Arbitrary metrics, like ensuring every single chapter is uniformly 2,000 words, give an anxious writer a false sense of control over the chaos. I don't know if my protagonist's emotional journey is resonant, but hey, my spreadsheet shows perfect numerical symmetry.
You are obsessing over the scaffolding instead of checking if the building is actually structurally sound. Hunt provides a wonderfully liberating answer to the chapter length question. There is no set length.
None at all. It is entirely dictated by the genre you are writing and the physiological reaction you want from the reader.
Let's look at the mechanics of pacing. If you are writing a high-octane commercial thriller, you are going to engineer very short, punchy chapters.
You want to insert chapter breaks right at the moment of highest tension, a literal or metaphorical cliffhanger.
Why? Because a chapter break physically forces the reader's eye down the page into the next, creating a compulsive, feverish, page-turning momentum. It mimics a rapid heartbeat.
But if you are writing a lush, atmospheric literary novel, a short chapter is actually destructive to your goal. In literary fiction, you're trying to sustain what the great writing teacher John Gardner called the fictive dream.
A vital concept. Explain how the fictive dream works mechanically.
The fictive dream is the hypnotic state where the reader forgets they are sitting in a chair reading black ink on white paper and they fully inhabit the world of the characters.
Like when you look up and suddenly 3 hours have passed.
Exactly. It takes time to pull a reader into that deep trance. A chapter break acts like a commercial break on television. It provides a natural stopping point.
The reader exhales, puts the book on the nightstand, and goes to sleep.
Yes. If you have too many chapter breaks in a literary novel, you keep snapping the reader out of the dream before they can fully submerge. So the length serves the psychological goal.
However, Hunt does outline one unbreakable structural rule for chapter breaks. You must insert them at any significant shift in time or place.
Oh, this is crucial.
If your characters are having a tense negotiation over coffee in sunny Florida in one scene, and the very next scene involves them shivering as they step off a plane in rainy Seattle, you need a hard chapter break.
If you jump from a flashback in 1893 back to the present day in 2027, you need a chapter break, and probably a bold 2027 at the top of the new page.
You cannot just jump locations in the middle of a continuous page of text. You will give the reader spatial whiplash.
And Hunt shares a fantastic, pragmatic secret about her own workflow regarding chapters. She doesn't even worry about chapter breaks or numbering while she's writing the first draft.
Really? None of it?
None of it. She just writes in continuous scenes. She only inserts a hard break while drafting if there's one of those major time or location jumps. Otherwise, she just uses a scene break symbol, like 3 asterisks.
Because she knows she might move scenes around drastically in the editing phase, rigidly numbering chapters in a first draft is just wasted effort. It's an illusion of progress.
It's a highly efficient way to work. But this discussion of pacing naturally brings us to the larger architectural question of format length.
Right, moving from chapters to whole books.
Hunt makes a very strong argument for mastering short forms of fiction, even if your ultimate goal is to write massive, sprawling novels. She uses a phrase that is arguably the most profound insight in her entire newsletter. Short forms teach what long forms can hide.
Let's dissect that. How exactly does a long novel hide weak writing?
Through sheer momentum and volume. A novel is massive, 80,000 to 100,000 words. Because of that size, it can absorb a shocking amount of structural damage without completely collapsing.
A novel can hide a soft, poorly written scene. It can hide a self-indulgent, boring tangent about the history of a town that has nothing to do with the plot.
The reader might skim those 3 pages, but the overall forward momentum of the book's central mystery will drag them through the muddy parts. The momentum covers the author's lack of discipline.
But a short story has absolutely nowhere to hide. Every single paragraph, every line of dialogue, every sensory detail has to earn its keep immediately, or the entire structure crumbles.
Exactly. And the foundational architecture of the story, what Hunt calls the plot skeleton, applies uniformly to every length.
Whether you are writing a 3,000-word story or a 300,000-word epic, the bones must be present. You must have a protagonist with a clear, obvious problem and a deeper, hidden internal need.
You need an inciting incident that shatters their status quo. You need escalating complications, a bleakest moment where all seems lost, and a resolution. The skeleton is non-negotiable.
So if the skeleton is identical, what is the mechanical difference between a novel and a short story?
Brutal, ruthless compression. In a novel, you have the luxury of space. You can introduce a sprawling cast of characters and interweave 3 different subplots that eventually collide in the climax.
In a short story, you must severely compress the complications and ruthlessly cut the cast. There are 0 subplots allowed.
Every secondary character must serve the protagonist's main arc directly, either as an obstacle or a mirror, or they must be deleted.
Let's actually map out these lengths because the publishing industry operates on very specific definitions. First, you have the classic short story. This runs from about 1,000 to 7,500 words.
And Hunt quotes the great Irish writer Frank O'Connor here, who had a fascinating philosophical take on the soul of the short story.
O'Connor argued that the novel requires a stable, functioning society to exist. A novel tracks how a character integrates with or rebels against a massive social structure over years.
But the short story, he said, belongs to the lonely figure. It belongs to the outsider standing at the edge of things.
It's a beautiful distinction. A short story doesn't have time to track a 30-year social evolution. It focuses on a single hinge point, One encounter on a train, one realization during a dinner party, one argument in a driveway where everything shifts in a single afternoon.
And from a purely practical standpoint, writing short stories allows a beginner to cycle through the entire business of publishing rapidly. You write it in a few weeks, submit it to prestigious markets like Plowshares, Asimov's Science Fiction, or Havoc.
Get your rejection or acceptance and learn the industry cycle in a matter of months, rather than the years it takes to query a novel. Then you step up to the somewhat awkward middle child of the publishing world, the novelette.
Ah, yes, the middle child.
This clocks in between 7,500 and 17,500 words. Historically, this length was a tough sell. It was often too long for a standard literary magazine to print without taking up the whole issue, but far too short to bind and sell as a standalone book.
But Hunt notes this form is highly popular in specific genre magazines, particularly in science fiction and fantasy places like Clark's World and Analog.
Because sci-fi requires world building. A 3,000-word short story isn't quite enough space to explain the physics of an alien Dyson sphere, but you might not have a complex enough plot to sustain a 90,000-word novel.
The novelette gives you exactly enough room to build the weird world and execute a tight plot within it.
And finally, we arrive at the novella, ranging from roughly 17,500 to 40,000 words. What is deeply fascinating about the novella right now is that it is experiencing a massive, unprecedented renaissance, almost entirely driven by the economics of digital publishing.
Explain the economic shift there, because it fundamentally changed what authors are allowed to write.
Okay, historically, printing a 30,000-word physical book was a financial nightmare for a traditional publisher. The spine of the book is so incredibly thin that it basically vanishes on a bookstore shelf. Readers can't see it.
You just walk right past it.
Furthermore, the cost of the paper, the cover design, the marketing, and the shipping is almost identical to the cost of a full novel, but readers refuse to pay $25 for something that looks like a pamphlet, so publishers hated them.
But the advent of the ebook completely shattered that math. A digital file has no spine width. It has no shipping cost.
Exactly. Now, science fiction publishers like Tor.com are building massive, highly lucrative franchises entirely on novellas. Look at Martha Wells's brilliant Murderbot Diaries. Those are novellas, and they are sweeping the awards and dominating the bestseller lists.
It freed the format from the physical limitations of paper. However, Hunt warns that novellas still exist in traditional print as highly specific products. Seasonal gift books.
Right, like a cozy Christmas mystery or a Mother's Day special edition.
Because these gift books are often printed in small, expensive hardcover formats, sometimes with color illustrations, the physical production costs remain very high. Therefore, Hunt emphasizes your prose at the novella length has to be absolutely exceptional to convince a publisher to take that specific financial risk.
Which provides the perfect transition to our final and most critical section. Once you've built your architecture, chosen your word count, and endured the psychological silence.
Where exactly does this story fit in the chaotic marketplace?
And more importantly, how do you ensure the writing itself isn't aggressively boring? Let's talk about finding your lane and finding your spark.
When amateur writers talk about categorization, they usually stop at genre. They say, I'm writing a sci-fi, or I'm writing a historical romance. But Hunt argues there's a much deeper, more structural set of labels that dictate how a book is edited, pitched, and consumed.
These are the three fundamental lanes of fiction: literary, commercial, and upmarket. Let's bypass the basic definitions and look at the underlying mechanics of these lanes, starting with literary fiction.
Hunt elegantly calls this the art of the inner life.
In a literary novel, the narrative weight, the engine that actually drives the reader forward, is carried by internal emotional shifts. The external plot might be incredibly quiet.
You're likely not dealing with ticking time bombs, serial killers, or massive space battles. The tension arises from a subtle strain in a 30-year marriage, a crisis of religious faith, or a quiet, devastating betrayal between sisters.
Furthermore, in literary fiction, the language itself is the primary experience. Readers of literary fiction want to stop and savor a perfectly constructed, complex metaphor. They read for the prose as much as the plot.
And crucially, literary fiction often explores highly complex, unresolved themes. It does not hand the reader neat, tidy, morally binary answers at the end. It invites the reader to sit in the discomfort of moral ambiguity.
On the absolute opposite end of this spectrum is commercial fiction. Hunt designates this as story first. This lane is built for wide, immediate, gripping appeal.
These are your massive airport thrillers, your page-turning mysteries, your blockbuster romances. The narrative weight here is entirely external. It runs on high-stakes action. Danger, pursuit, explicit conflict.
The hooks are aggressive and immediate. In a commercial thriller, someone is dead on page 1, and the detective has a gun to their head by page 10.
The language in commercial fiction is intentionally accessible. It acts as a clear, polished window pane. You are supposed to look through the language to see the action happening on the other side. You're not supposed to stop and admire the glass.
And most importantly, commercial fiction provides a definitive emotional payoff. Justice is served to the villain, the lovers overcome the misunderstanding, the monster is blown up, the reader is guaranteed closure.
Then you have the highly coveted, deeply complex sweet spot in the middle. Upmarket fiction. This is where art meets story. These are the massive runaway book club favorites that dominate the cultural conversation.
Right. Upmarket fiction borrows the forward momentum and structural pacing of a commercial novel. So things are actually happening, there's an external plot driving the timeline, but it features the highly nuanced, deeply flawed characters and the discussion-worthy, morally gray themes of a literary novel.
The prose is elevated and beautiful, but it is disciplined enough to never slow down the narrative drive.
Hunt provides a brilliant, practical diagnostic quiz in her newsletter to help you figure out which lane you are currently driving in. If you are working on a manuscript right now, ask yourself, what carries the most weight in my story?
If the heaviest element is the character's internal moral struggle, you lean literary. If it's the external life or death conflict, you lean commercial.
Look at your sentences. Are you agonizing for an hour over the rhythmic cadence of a single metaphor? You are in literary territory. Are you ruthlessly cutting adjectives to prioritize a clean, unobtrusive pace? You are driving in the commercial lane.
And what is absolutely vital to understand, and Hunt makes this very clear, is that none of these lanes are inherently better or more legitimate than the others.
Writing an airtight, commercially successful locked-room mystery requires immense structural and architectural genius. Writing a quiet literary novel requires immense psychological insight and linguistic mastery.
The goal is not to force yourself into a lane you think is prestigious. The goal is to find the lane where your natural voice thrives.
Because if you try to staple a high-octane commercial murder mystery onto a quiet, introspective, literary family drama, the structural mismatch is going to give your reader whiplash.
Which brings us to the ultimate, final hurdle. Once you are in the correct lane, how do you write exceptionally well within it? How do you stand out?
Hunt references a fantastic article from Publishers Weekly, written by former book reviewer Renee Nicholson. Nicholson states something that completely reframes the rejection process. She argues that the biggest problem in modern publishing, the reason most manuscripts are rejected, isn't actually that the writing is bad.
This insight blew my mind. Nicholson says the most common pervasive issue she encounters in slush piles is competent writing that lacks spark.
It is the most damning critique possible. It's a manuscript that does everything technically right. The grammar is flawless, the plot hits the required beats, the formatting is perfect.
But the book is utterly, aggressively forgettable. It's bland, it's safe, it has no soul.
So how do you inject that spark? How do you move from merely competent to undeniably exceptional? Nicholson outlines 4 strategies, and Hunt adapts them beautifully for the working writer. Number 1, you have to take a risk.
Do not play it safe. In fiction, this might mean utilizing a highly unreliable narrator, playing with fractured nonlinear timelines, or writing from the perspective of the villain.
In nonfiction or essay writing, it means presenting an argument that runs completely counter to the conventional wisdom of your audience.
Hunt provides a great example from her own career regarding rhetorical risk. She wrote an article questioning the unquestioned modern paradigm of Christian education.
She asked if it was possible to have too much of a good thing, arguing that aggressively sheltering students might actually prevent them from developing the resilient, tested worldview they need because they never encounter the friction of people who believe differently.
And again, for our listener, we are analyzing the rhetorical structure of taking a risk, not taking a stance on the educational debate itself. The brilliant mechanical point is that she presented a counterintuitive premise to an audience that expected safety. She introduced friction.
And that friction forced the reader to stop scrolling, engage with the text, and think. That is the spark. Strategy number 2, enter a conversation. When you write, are you subverting a genre tradition? Are you honoring one?
Don't just copy the tropes of whatever vampire or detective novel is currently popular. Figure out what you can add to the collective well that hasn't been said.
Strategy number 3, have a distinct, undeniable voice. This ties directly back to our conversation about the dangers of AI and the diffusion of responsibility in writing groups.
If you workshop your manuscript through a committee of 10 different writers until every sharp, weird edge is safely sanded down, or worse, if you use a language model to smooth out your prose, you're going to sound exactly like everyone else.
Generic writing is overflowing with tired cliches and dialogue where the 80-year-old grandmother sounds syntactically identical to the 16-year-old boy. The spark lives in the weird, specific edges of your unique voice.
Finally, strategy number 4. Offer genuine complexity. Your characters must have fatal flaws and devastating blind spots. They must be contradictory, hypocritical, and capable of surprising themselves, just like real human beings.
Your ending should be surprising, yet in hindsight feel entirely inevitable. And if we connect this back to finding your lane, correctly identifying if you are upmarket, literary, or commercial, dictate the specific types of risks you are allowed to take.
A literary reader will happily accept a completely ambiguous, unresolved ending. A commercial reader will literally throw the book across the room if you don't reveal who the killer is. You have to know the rules of your lane before you can effectively break them.
It's about knowing exactly what promises you're making to the reader. Hunt brings up a phenomenal example of executing complexity and risk within a highly specific genre. If you are writing hard science fiction, the ultimate risk is boring your reader to tears with mathematics.
She points to Andy Weir's novel Project Hail Mary as the absolute gold standard for exceptional, scientifically accurate writing.
Oh, Weir's a masterclass in this.
How does he achieve it mechanically? He succeeds because he relentlessly shows the science in action. He never once relies on a massive information dump, where a character pauses the story to deliver a 3-page textbook lecture to the reader about astrophage physics.
Right. The reader's understanding of the physics comes entirely from watching the protagonist frantically try to manipulate those scientific principles in real time, so he doesn't blow himself up in the vacuum of space. The science is the tension.
It is the ultimate execution of show don't tell. But to execute that, the writer must be in absolute total command of their material. You cannot fake that level of integration.
You cannot outsource it. You have to build the bridge yourself.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have traversed the psychology, the architecture, and the execution of the craft.
Let's pull all of this together. We started by looking at the sheer titanium fortitude required to face the maddening silence of the marketplace. We learned that writing is a profound, invisible investment. To survive, you must sever your self-worth from the audience's reaction. You must aggressively build and calibrate an internal compass by seeking professional friction, rely on the unsexy discipline of a production schedule, and develop a remarkably thick skin.
We explored why we must absolutely reject the alluring, algorithmic shortcuts of AI. We established that outsourcing the struggle of creation doesn't just result in generic, sparkless prose. It fundamentally robs you of the cognitive, emotional, and neurobiological growth that the agonizing work is supposed to produce within you. The friction is the point.
We looked at the extreme precision required in our vocabulary, dissecting the defensive mechanics of ad hominem attacks, and studying how to deploy the heavy gravity of a laconic response.
We studied the structural architecture of the craft, learning why arbitrary chapter word counts are just a psychological safety blanket, and why mastering the brutal compression of the short story teaches you vital lessons that a sprawling, momentum-heavy novel will hide.
And finally, we diagnosed our precise place in the market literary, commercial, or upmarket, so we can intelligently take the risks necessary to elevate our work from merely competent to undeniably exceptional.
And to continuously hone these skills, to keep calibrating your internal compass, I cannot recommend highly enough that you, our listener, go subscribe to Angela Hunt's Write Well newsletter at angelahunt.substack.com. It truly is a masterclass delivered straight to your inbox, written by someone who has climbed the mountain 170 times.
It is an indispensable resource. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think back to that absurd image we started with. The writer in the thick red snowsuit, hauling that heavy cast iron typewriter up the freezing, lonely slopes of Everest, building that suspension bridge in the dark.
It is hard, often agonizing, deeply invisible work.
But as Ezra Klein reminded us, the true purpose of grappling with a difficult text, the true purpose of doing the exhausting work of writing, is to permanently change who you are. The text works on you just as much as you work on the text.
So here is the question you have to answer the next time you sit down at a blank screen.
What brilliant, capable version of yourself are you actively preventing from coming into existence every single time you let a shortcut tool or a paralyzing fear of the silence cut your creative struggles short?